say the Nicene Creed every Sunday at Holy Mass. Many martyrs have shed their own blood in defense of the creed. One specific saint, St. Peter Martyr, was struck by an axe, and as he was dying, he got up on one knee, dipped his finger in his own blood, and wrote, Credo in Deum, on the ground. Yet how casual are we in reciting the creed at Mass? When we go to our death to defend the creed like St. Peter Martyr? There is a rich and awesome history behind the creeds. Deacon Walters and Stephen Ray go into this rich history in their newest book, The Catholic Creed, An Introduction to the Faith. Deacon Steve, it's great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I have just a few questions, if you guys don't mind me running down through them. The first one was, what inspired you to write this book?
Go for it, Dennis.
Do you want me to answer that? Okay. We were actually commissioned by Catholic Answers to contribute to a series of books that were intended to be catechetical in nature for high school students and young college students. And there was supposed to be a whole series of these things. There was one on the church, one on Mary, and one on the papacy, and so forth. We wrote the book on the papacy. We wrote the book on the creed. But unfortunately, the person who commissioned this project at Catholic Answers passed away, and the whole project just disappeared. But in the meantime, when the project was coming up, they indicated what they wanted the structure to be, including a list of objections of things at the end. So almost every book that we were writing would have, how do we answer those objections? And so that's what inspired us to write the book. The researching of the book led me at least into a whole lot of scripture and a whole lot of happy accidents where I just find myself discovering one thing after another, in terms of the history of the creed. I found all kinds of early creeds that, the bishops would make up in order to instruct catechumens in the faith. And it was just fascinating. So that's, at least from my angle, what inspired us to write the book. And I'd like Steve to sort of tag in on that.
Well, being a convert to the Catholic Church, I just fell in love with the creed. And many times at Mass in my first years, when we recited the creed, I got tears in my eyes as we recited it, because it was mine now, especially the line, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I'd have tears running down my eyes. So having the chance to write about the creed was a great opportunity for me to learn more about it and its history, but also to write it with Dennis, Deacon Dennis, because he wasn't a deacon back then. And he was so instrumental in my understanding the Catholic faith, because I came from an evangelical background, and studying the creed was great for me to get my roots in. But also Dennis taught me, he taught me all things Catholic. I didn't have to go to RCIA, and I'm eternally indebted to him for all the time he very generously gave of his life to teach Janet and I all about the faith, including the creed. So to get to write that together with him, and he did most of the writing, I'll tell you that right now, to do that together with him was a great blessing, and also to help other Catholics and non-Catholics understand what we really believe and teach. So those are my reasons.
Yeah. And
one other thing I could add on to that is that one of the things that I came to realize through a lot of RCI work, I've been doing RCI for well over 30 years, is that a lot of Catholics who have been catechized in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the early 2000s need to be catechized all over again. Whatever they learned was inadequate. And it's astounding to me how many people who have gone through 12 years of Catholic education don't know the basics of their own faith. So this was one of the reasons why we did a book like this.
Yeah, that's great. And Deacon, as you were mentioning about Catholic Answers earlier, I really liked in the back of the book how you had objections. I was curious, what part of the creed do you think most Catholics would have trouble with? Or do have trouble with?
There was an objection. What practical difference does the creed make? Now, I don't know whether we answered that specifically in the list of objections, but there were some. Well, here's one. The creed should not be closed, but should be a living document that changes to reflect various times and cultures. This is a tendency in the post-Vatican II church to revise teachings, the moral teachings of the church especially. And the creed does have practical application for this. So it seems as though there are a lot of people who just want to make the church adapt to the culture of the time rather than the other way around. And really, I think Jesus expects us to adapt the culture to the church.
Exactly. I would agree with that and say that the objection, maybe not to any one statement of the creed, but an objection to the creed as a whole, because like the Constitution of the United States, there are those who want that to be a living document that really doesn't mean anything and it's not tied to history. Right. That we would like to have the church no longer be a kingdom with a statement, but make it a democracy so that we can vote. And I think that's the mentality of many American Catholics anyway, is an objection to the creed as a whole. But I think when it comes to specific things, the general world or some of those less well catechized would object, like we had talked earlier before about Pontius Pilate, because I had somebody say to me one time, I have no problem with your creed because it's all spiritual statements that you can all believe. I have an objection to you mentioning Pontius Pilate, because when you do that, you're trying to tie this into real history. And the fact is, yes, we are. The creed is tied into real history. The Catholic faith is not something we just have faith in. It's not just something we believe. We believe it for good and substantial reasons, that it is rooted in history and it is the truth. And if it's the truth, that means other creeds are not, which makes Catholicism superior. And I don't mind saying that. And therefore, the creed is rooted in history and it is something that we are required to believe. Yeah, and I love believing in it, by the way.
Well, Steve, as you were coming into the church, were you very much put off by the creed, or was it more like, oh, this is wonderful? It's very, systematic, if you will. I mean, things are very well thought out. Or was it just, no, I just reject this. It's too much?
As an evangelical Protestant, I always loved the creeds of the faith, but I read them through my evangelical glasses, so my Protestant lens, so to speak. And so I would change words as I went along to fit my perspective. So I'll use the example of one holy Catholic and apostolic church. I could accept the word apostolic, but it had a different meaning than what the Catholics did. It means it's what the apostles taught, not that there was a succession from the apostles, apostolic succession. One Catholic church, I could accept the one, but I had the idea of an invisible unity. All of us competing 40,000 different denominations. Can't we all just get along? That was kind of my idea of one. We had a spiritual unity, even though we were fighting on the ground. Holy, I would say, well, we're not holy. We're all a bunch of sinners, but I understand now that the term holy means that God has made us holy and is making us individuals holy. But the big one was Catholic, because we would emphasize that has to be a small c Catholic. It can't be capital Catholic as in a title of a church. And we even went to one evangelical church right before we became Catholics that said, we believe in one holy Christian and apostolic church. That is a revision of history. That is changing the meaning of a word as it was meant and has always meant in the history of the Catholic Church. But I read it with different lens, with an evangelical Protestant lens. When I became Catholic, I fell in love with the creed. I always loved the creed, but now I loved it in its historical context with the contextual meaning of the words. And I was a Catholic, and that's why I said earlier, I used to weep at Mass reciting the creed. I still do sometimes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kind of going back to what I think, Deacon, you were saying earlier as well, there it seems like you called out the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s and how people need to be recatechized. I'm always interested in learning like what the breakdown was or how that happened and what the solutions of it. Now, Deacon, I think that you teach RCIA, and actually it sounds like, Deacon, you really helped bring Steve and his wife into the faith. But what yeah, like what happened? Why were we just too timid in our approach of saying, no, we are the one true holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? Like what was it?
Well, I think in part there was a redefinition among some people of what the church is and whose church it is. I mean, if you remember the early 70s and so forth, if you would go to church, there would be banners all over the place. We are church. We are welcoming one another. The churches even were reconfigured so that we're all facing each other rather than the altar.
Right.
There was a lot of that. And I think that confused the nature of things, so that something like Catholic, for example, wouldn't matter because, we're open to everybody. But Catholic also means, pertaining to the whole, and that also means the whole doctrine of the apostles, which, if you examine it pretty carefully, it's the narrow way. It's the narrow way that leads to eternal life, and a lot of people just don't like to hear that. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, that totally does. So yeah, I think you guys have, so just going to the 4 marks, and Steve, you touched upon this a little bit, but the one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, why are those 4 so, much more important, or maybe not more important, but why are those specifically set apart than the other parts of the creed, those 4 marks?
Because the church is something. It's not just a loose association of a bunch of brothers and sisters who love Jesus. It is something. It's one. That means around the face of the globe, it is one. It's not by chance that there were 120 people in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. Right. Because in the Jewish context and in the tradition of the Jews, you had to, if you were going to leave the major metropolitan area with its courts and its system of government and start your own outside, you needed 120 people in order to do that. And that's exactly what we have at the birthday of the church. They're leaving one society, they're starting their own new society. They're going to have their own judicial system, their own legislature and courts, their own civic government. It is one government that's moving out to start something, those who are called out. It's not by chance that there's 120, because that ties right into Jewish tradition and history. They are starting something new, and it is something. It is a society. It's not invisible. It is a visible civic government, so to speak. And that is going to spread around the world. So it's one, it's apostolic because it is apostolic succession. Jesus sent the apostles out. They laid hands on each other, and that's how bishops are. Without that, you're not part of the church, the visible Catholic Church. It's Catholic because it's universal, like Dennis said, of the whole. It is all the truth for all the people for all of the time. So that doesn't matter whether you're in Saudi Arabia or in Alaska or in China. It's the same one holy Catholic and apostolic church, which is why we have trouble with China right now, because they're wanting to elect their own bishops apart from Rome. And then there comes a whole question of, are they really ordained as bishops, and are they really part of the one church? Because we are something, and those 4 marks of the church identify who we are. And it also lays parameters and boundaries as to who we are and what we are.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. One thing when I was reading the book, and in
terms of unity, by the way, St. Paul was always. I was just wanted to comment on the unity idea. In Scripture, especially in Paul's letters, you see a constant emphasis when he's writing the Catholic epistles to Timothy and to Titus. You teach the one faith, and the reason for that was because a lot of people were just going off on their own to sort of imagine what it is that Christ taught, and then they would sort of extrapolate off of that. And there were all kinds of very early divisions. It's amazing the number. Sometimes we get the idea that the early church was just one big unity. No, it wasn't. There were people that Paul was very concerned about maintaining unity of faith, unity of doctrine, unity of understanding, unity of government, and so. That was one of the things. The idea of the apostolic succession is that it was very important to know who ordained you, because if he was illegitimate, you weren't ordained. And if you weren't ordained, you couldn't teach the proper Catholic faith.
And in regards to that as well, the way they dealt with heretics before the New Testament even was written, which didn't come about until the end of the 4th century when we had a final collection of books called the New Testament. How did you debate a heretic? You'd say, well, my bishop was as a successor of this bishop, of this bishop, of this bishop, all the way back to Rome. So we win. Right. And that's how it was. That was the source of authority and of Orthodox teaching, is if it came through the proper line of apostolic succession, and especially back to Rome. So this was the creed was important for people to know what they believe, to have a succinct and concise statement of their faith that even the simpleton, even the child, even the old lady with the babushka who couldn't read, they could recite this creed and have the basics of what we believe. And they could argue with a heretic with that if they had to, because they knew those words and they knew that that was the concise summary of what our teaching is.
Right. Well, and I'm definitely not trying to beat up on Protestants with that, but that was one thing that I could never understand, is just that line of reasoning, Steve, when you can trace it all the way back to St. Peter. And to me, it's an authority. It's an authority issue. I never understood, because I was a cradle Catholic. I couldn't understand how someone could have an objection to, I can trace this lineage all the way back to St. Peter. Well,
quite easily, because the Protestants, they protested. They said the church may have started out that way and it may have been good, but they screwed it all up now, and it's no longer what it was supposed to be. So we're breaking away and we're going to start over fresh again. And what they do then is they reject the Pope, they reject the tradition, they reject the altars in most cases, and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They threw out 5 of the sacraments and they only kept 2. That's a pretty gutsy thing to do when the church has had 7 sacraments from the beginning. You're really saying we are rebelling against what Christianity has been. We're starting our own, and we're going to rechange words. We're going to rewrite history. And the Anglicans were really good at that, of rewriting all of that and saying that under Queen Elizabeth as the head of the church, we can still get away with it because we are the real apostolic church. But if you redefine words, we know that in our modern culture, you redefine words, you can redefine ideas and minds.
Yeah. And that's what you subscribed to, right? Before you came into the faith.
Oh, exactly. Martin Luther was my hero. I used to have Martin Luther t-shirts. And I said that the Catholics were the church was a whore of Babylon, the Pope was the Antichrist, and you were all going to hell. So for me to become Catholic was really quite a transition.
Yeah, it sounds like it. One thing that I was reading in the book was when St. Cyril was saying safeguarding the hidden teachings. And essentially he was saying not to reveal what they've learned in class to outsiders. I just was curious to kind of get your comment on, why that was, and if you could expand upon that a little bit.
Can I take that one?
Sure.
Actually, I thought St. Cyril was a little mild in the way he approached it, because he said you don't communicate these things to outsiders because they don't have the basis of understanding to be able to understand this properly. But in fact, there was a big tradition during periods of persecution. That's prior to 325 AD. All right, that's when Constantine came into power. That you kept things hidden because you didn't want to reveal them to outsiders, because you might have spies and people who would, come in and find out who you were, identifies you as a Christian, and feed you to the lions. So there was a lot of this idea that they called it the arcane teachings, the hidden teachings. There were certain things that you could know. I mean, you would know certain basic things about the moral teachings, but certain things having to do with the Trinity, the certain things having to do with the Eucharist, certain things having to do with the way we worship, particularly the way we worship, because that was all done in private, away from catechumens even, you didn't want to let these things out to people who had no basis for understanding why we thought the way we did. In some ways, I think that we're kind of like back to that era in some of the modern church, because there are a lot of people who nowadays don't understand why the church celebrates the Mass the way she does.
Right.
Yep. Then only the initiated were allowed into the club.
The Our Father, for example, the Lord's Prayer. Remember, at the Mass, we dare to say the prayer that our catechumens were never allowed to say that prayer. It was only after you were baptized and initiated into the church and could attend the liturgy for the first time yourself that you were allowed to say the Lord's Prayer. Now, to us, this is astonishing, but in those days, this was just something that you didn't do if you weren't a Christian already.
Right.
Because he wasn't their father yet, in the sense of Christianity. They hadn't been born again yet into that family. Yeah. And I like to say that it's a private club in a way, and you have to be initiated. You have to know what that private club teaches and what they hold to, and you have to be willing to commit your life to it. And so before that happens, you were on the outside. For that reason, even most of the first churches, the baptismal fonts were outside the church. So that the pagan was baptized outside the church before they were brought in as members of the family or of the club. And you especially couldn't be there for the Eucharist. And these are the great mysteries that are special to us. And I think in some ways that they are lessened today by the very fact that anybody can just walk in, anybody can take part of things. And most priests aren't going to stop people from even taking the Eucharist, having no clue who they are or where they're from. So in a way, we diminish the value of that private club and make it open to everyone. But even before, you had to be baptized outside the church. And I like even churches that have the baptismal fonts in the back, like our home parish does, Dennis and I used to go to, is that the baptismal is in the back because it symbolizes you have to first be baptized before you can come into the doorway of the church, because baptism was always considered the doorway into the church.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. I guess after writing this book and, as you're reciting the creed at Mass, has that changed? Do you pay, I'm sure you were paying more or paying attention to it at Mass before you wrote the book, but, after writing this, are you more keen on what you're saying and the meaning behind of what you're saying? And also for those, because sometimes, and to kind of confess to you guys, I don't know what percent it is, but maybe it's like 30-40%. Sometimes I'm saying it and, I'm just, I will lose train of thought and I'm just saying it. I know that that's wrong, but maybe some tips on, when we get to the Nicene Creed, how to better concentrate and really, understand what it is that you're saying and that they're not just words.
We say the Apostles' Creed every time we say the Rosary, and we just sort of rush right through it in order to get to the good parts, the mysteries. But the Apostles' Creed actually has some things in it that the Nicene Creed does not. For example, the resurrection of the body. Mm-hmm. The Nicene Creed doesn't specify the resurrection of the body. It talks about the resurrection from the dead. If you really want to go into a lot of the detail about Christians' belief, you would recite the Nicene Creed, but understanding that it has a practical value. They used to call it the rule of faith. The rule of faith was the way you lived as a Christian. It wasn't simply what you believed. It was the way you acted. And the way we put it in the book is that, for example, if you think that Jesus is the judge of the living and the dead, you better pay attention to the way you behave, because your eternal salvation depends on it. And I remember one of the items that I reflect on a lot is Jesus is the judge of the living, which means that my own conduct as a deacon, as a member of the church, as a brother in Christ to people, God is going to judge me on the way I behave and even sometimes the way I think about people. This is very practical for me. And I think that reflecting on Jesus as the judge of the living and the dead has made a big difference in my own life.
Along with the baptism being the doorway into the church, these creedal statements had to be memorized by those who were coming into the church. We had to know that this is why Dennis teaches RCIA. He teaches them these things, and they have to be willing to recite that creed prior to baptism and know what it means so that they are sure. For example, in Turkey, for example, which is 99.9% Muslims, one of them converted as a result of my 20-year relationship with him. He's now a Christian. They will not let a person convert and become a Christian for 4 years. They have to go through 4 years of RCIA because you can lose your life for becoming a Christian in Turkey. So you have to know that you really believe, and you have to know what you believe, and you have to say you really believe it and know the cost you're going to pay by believing it. So before baptism, you have to say that creed. You have to know what it means. That's what RCIA teaches you, those things, and it should. Most of them don't. Most RCIA are very poor. When people ask me, I send them to Dennis's class, by the way. I say, well, I know one good place you can go. But that way you told what you believe before you're baptized. Now, as far as you asked the question, has it meant more to me? When I became Catholic, I made up my mind that I was going to have the creed so easy and lucid on my lips that if I ever have to go through a martyrdom, although I hate pain, and I would trust God to give me the grace to go through it, that's for sure. But if I do, I'm going down with the creed, with the words of the creed on my lips, just like you had mentioned the saint earlier who had wrote it in blood. Yeah. I will die shouting the creed.
That's awesome. That really is.
Instead of screaming in pain, I'm going to scream the creed.
If they give you the time to do that. Yes.
If they do.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that was the list of questions that I had. Did you guys have any closing remarks at all? One other thing. The one thing I really liked is how you literally picked apart each of the sections of the creed, give an awesome explanation, and then kind of like you have these boxes within each of them that shows these really good tips and really cool stories and what they mean. It was easy to go through. So, there's certain sections that I'm like, well, I need a better explanation on this. Go right to that section of the book, and it's just laid out really nicely.
I'll just add to this and then let Dennis have the final word. I think it's very nicely written, and I love the way you designed it as a hardback with a beautiful dust jacket. It's really a beautiful book. I mean, it just feels nice to hold it and smell it. If nothing, it's just well-made book. But I like the way it's deep enough for a professor because it lays things out in simple terms. Oftentimes professors get so lost in their gobbledygook of language and trying to impress people that they don't reach people. This will help a scholar understand it in simple terms and relate it to simple people. But it's also the simplest of people can pick this book up and read it because it's written for the scholar, but also for the novice. And I would like to see deacons and priests use this in their homilies because so few people don't understand the creed. We don't need feel-good homilies all the time. We don't need happy, clappy Jesus homilies. People need to learn the faith, especially in these times when it's becoming much and much more difficult to stay an authentic Catholic. We need to know what we have. So I would love to see priests break this down in their homilies and go through this book and teach the faith step by step so that over a year's time, people have been instructed in the details of their creed.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is good about the book too is that, as Steve said, it's easy enough for beginners, but people can take any one of these articles of the creed and then go in much greater detail. Just the simple question is about the Father, for example, is God male? And the Catechism touches on that. It's a big issue in today's culture. It's how do we talk about God? I think that it's important for people to understand that, in addition to the fact that the Scripture always talks about God in the masculine, that we're using analogical language. We, in English at least, we have, what shall we say, 2.5 genders, male, female, and neuter. And you've got to use one or the other. And at least in standard English, the male can refer to either sex. But the idea that God has both paternal and maternal attributes to him, you take that kind of a thought and just probe much more deeply into it. How does God love us? Well, one of the ways that obviously that he loves us is as a father. but he loves us also because he sends his son into the world to die for rebels and apostates and people who refuse to obey his law. And they're going to do that. And God loves us that much that he's going to call us out of that and into his heavenly kingdom. And I don't know, I just think that people can take any article in the creed and just be able to just plumb so much deeper into what it actually says, as well
And
as
with the book, there's other resources, and it gives quotes from the fathers and the catechism and the popes. So it gives further sources of information and reference for people who want to dig deeper into it as well.
right. And tons of scripture passages.
Yeah.
This, if nothing else, the creed and the catechism prove that the Catholic Church is a biblical religion. Contrary to what I thought as a Protestant, there is no more biblical church, no more biblical teaching than the Catholic Church. And when you study the creed, like Dennis and I did and put in this book, you will find out how biblical and scriptural the creed is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Deacon, just sorry, one other question. I'm just curious as to like how Steve was in class. Was he very, in RCIA? Was he, just asking a ton of questions? Was he objecting to a lot of stuff that you were saying, or what was he like?
I was thinking about that earlier, and it occurred to me that my issues, any kind of resistance that went on, Steve was pretty well convinced by the time I got there, because he had been talking to Al Krista, and he had attended, I think at that point, Catholic liturgy. So he was starting to get enculturated to that. But it occurred to me that the persons who I felt when I was going through the catechesis with him, I only spent about 6 weeks with the family, is his daughter Cindy and his daughter Charlotte. The two of them, I thought, were the ones whose nut I needed to crack. And I think I may have gotten through to Cindy. I wasn't so sure about Charlotte. But I like Charlotte better. I really like Charlotte.
Well, I'm actually at Charlotte's house right now. She just had a new baby.
Oh, yeah.
And we're helping her. I'm at Charlotte's house in South Carolina. And let me tell you why the kids had a bit of resistance, because we homeschooled our kids and we taught them about the Catholic Church from our old anti-Catholic curriculum. So our kids said, you want us to join that church? Did you forget what you taught us in homeschooling? Did you forget you taught us about the Pope being the Antichrist? And now you think we're just going to roll over and join it? And my kids are thinking kids. They're not dumb. They think. And so we had to have them buy into it on their own. And Dennis helped us tremendously with that.
And how long did that take, do you think? Like, I mean, was it, a few months, a year after you told them?
Yeah, as far as how long it took them to accept it, I don't know. I spent 6 weeks with the family. Steve, how long did it take them to buy into it?
Each of them differently, but Charlotte and Emily were young enough that they didn't really have any choice. The older two were teenagers and they had their own choice. But I had, in the process, written a letter to my father, and it became a book called Crossing the Tiber. But I had written that letter to my father, and it was still just in rough draft. When the kids said, we're not going to join with you, I got this brilliant idea. I printed out the letter to Grandpa, and I said, would you please proofread this for me before I send it to Grandpa? They went upstairs in their bedroom that night, and they didn't come down until 10 o'clock in the evening. They even skipped dinner. And at 10 o'clock, they came down with tears in their eyes, and they said, Dad, we read that letter. It was a good letter, and we've decided we're going to join with you.
Wow, that's awesome. What a great story.
Wow.
Cool. Well, I maybe we'll end on that happy note there.
I'd just like to say thank you to Tan Books for publishing this in such a beautiful edition. Thanks to Dennis for all the work he did. He did the majority of the writing, and it was a delight working with him. He's got a great mind. He's got the mind of the church, and I just enjoyed that so much. And it was a great blessing now to see it and to have it in our hands in such a beautiful edition. I'm probably going to read it every year again.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks.
Thank you.